Welcome into Floyd Street's Finest. I am Jack Grossman. That is the godfather of IU podcasting, Dr. Galen Clavio, my former professor back in the day, host of CrimsonCast, who has had quite the run this football season for sure, with you and Scott Galen. But really appreciate you coming on. And man, we'll just we won't harp on it too long, but I feel like there's nowhere else to start but with kind of the IU football season. 10-1, top five, still got a chance at the college football playoff. How's that been for you, man? I know I've enjoyed the heck out of it.
We've been doing football podcasting for 15 plus years now. Used to not get a lot of attention. I liken it to, it's kind of like the Beverly Hillbillies, where like you happen to be living on ground that looked worthless, and then all of a sudden oil pops up, and then you're living in LA. It's been like that, where everybody's suddenly interested in football, and I couldn't be happier. Just the way the team has played, the complete change in the mentality of the program, and it's been so much fun, Jack. I mean, you went to so many football games as a student, and fun wasn't always the first word that came to mind, but that stadium has been an electric that I have never experienced before at Indiana. So it's just been a thrill.
Yeah, no, I was at the UCLA game. We sat by each other at the UCLA game, which I
Right.
would argue that is probably the most fun I've ever had at a football game, to be completely honest. And that was, not even in Bloomington. That was in, LA and all that stuff. But
Yeah, it
yeah,
was it was just like, I mean, all the road experiences have been awesome because there are so many IU fans. Like, people don't realize how many alums there are all over the country. And they've frankly, with both basketball and football, just been waiting for something to party around. And football has given them that so far this year.
yeah, which there unfortunately hasn't been a lot. Like you said it wasn't fun when I was in school. I had before this year one of the more successful runs of 4 years of Indiana football.
Yep.
They made a couple bowl games. They had the 8-4 year my senior year with Penix and Ramsey and the Alabama coaching staff and those guys. And the basketball team didn't make the tournament at any of those 4 years. So very yeah, I was the first class since 1971 to see that game. Very very fun,
I
but.
mean, it feels like sometimes you just get dealt a bad hand. That was definitely a bad hand. So we'll send you like a fruit basket or something as an apology. I think we owe it to you at least to do that.
Oh, I love it. I love it. Anyways, you can find Galen on CrimsonCast Substack, at CrimsonCast on Twitter, X, whatever you want to call it. It's always Twitter. This is Floyd Street's Finest. You can find us at Jack Grossman 97 on Twitter. I'm on Blue Sky. I actually got Jack Grossman on Blue Sky, which is great, but you can find us also on Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, all that good stuff. But Galen, football aside, we could do an hour and a half on just college football playoff stuff, and I would love that. But this is a Louisville basketball podcast, and we do have a Louisville Indiana basketball game coming up here on Wednesday, a feast week. So that's kind of snuck up on us a little bit, even though I have been absolutely jacked for this for a very long time now. But we'll go ahead and start here, Galen. Just kind of looking at Indiana basketball so far this year. A lot of expectations, a lot of talent. It's been kind of a mixed bag so far. This will kind of be their first challenge against a team that's not South Carolina in the regular season. Just what are your thoughts about Indiana coming into this game?
This might be the weirdest feeling start to a season we've had since like 2015-16, which ended with IU winning a Big Ten title that year. So, maybe that's what you need, is that awkwardness at the beginning. But, on the one hand, the team's 4-0, and that does count for something. They've steadily moved up the Ken Pom rankings. Yeah, I think they're 31st now, or 36th now, but they were 42nd to start the season. They've kind of bounced around there. Yeah, I mean, there have been good moments. They blow out Eastern Illinois, and especially in the second half. They struggle a little bit in the first half. So it's like good moment, but a little bit of a bad moment. South Carolina, they go on some big runs, take a big lead, kind of collapse. Same thing happened in the UNC Greensboro game. They're clearly more talented, like by far, than they were last year. Miles Rice looks like an awesome point guard to have. Mackenzie Mbako has clearly stepped it up a level offensively. Looks like the type of guy that Duke wanted to bring in their freshman class last year. Malik Renew certainly looks like he's improved his game. Bryson Tucker looks like a great addition. So there's a lot of good pieces. But, I did a preview podcast on Inside the Hall at the beginning of the year. And one of the things that I mentioned there was the big concern with the IU fan base is, can this team be consistently good? Can they look like they're consistently engaged? Because that was one of the big problems that everybody had last year, on top of the losses that engulfed the team in February. So far, if you're looking for proof that this team's going to be more consistent and more engaged, there's not a lot of evidence that indicates that. They've played well in spurts. They're clearly doing some slightly different things offensively, but everything that they're doing that you would say, hey, that's good, I like seeing that change, you could find some kind of opposite piece of evidence to say they're not actually doing things to that level. And so it is very ambivalent among the fan base right now. And that's going to be a really interesting factor as we go into these 3 games in Atlantis.
Yeah, and I would argue this is the biggest 3 game stretch of the season for Indiana. For Louisville, I think this game's a lot bigger than what we thought during the preseason as well, based off of how the Tennessee game went for Louisville, where they kind of got boat raced in the Yum Center, to where now Louisville's using this as their big, okay, we got to prove something game. Indiana is looking at it as like, okay, we got to play Gonzaga. We got to try to get Arizona in some way, shape, or form because of how Mike Woodson set up the non-conference schedule to where there's not a lot of really good chances to get wins out there outside of the battle for Atlantis. So if you lose to Louisville, you're playing West Virginia, who's not great, and then some combination of a Providence with Bryce Hopkins just now coming back, or a Davidson, maybe in Oklahoma. It's the quality of opponent for both of these teams, whether you win or lose, where you might be playing Gonzaga, the best team in the country, if you win, is very, very an underlying part of this game, to where I think for Indiana, I'd argue the Louisville game is Indiana's biggest game on the schedule, because this is their chance to go and get some big games against big name teams if you don't win them, to help the strength of schedule, help, the metrics and all that stuff.
This was something when the schedule first got released, everybody that was paying attention was like, that's it. Like, so much. And the thing is, like, you're playing in Atlantis, you have the possibility, as you said, of playing Arizona. If you're Indiana, you have the possibility of playing Gonzaga, but you have to beat Louisville to get to that. And if you don't, as you said, like, now you're playing some other teams that are mid, pack in terms of their own conferences. Yes, there'll be neutral site games. You'll have to win those games, but how much will that help you come tournament selection time? Because you look at Indiana's schedule, as you said, like the remaining non-conference schedule after Atlantis is Sam Houston State, Miami of Ohio, Chattanooga, and Winthrop. All those games are at home, so they don't calculate as high in the net. And then you leave yourself the 20 games of the Big Ten schedule. And the Big Ten schedule doesn't have a lot of really highly rated teams right now. I think the highest rated team Indiana's got in that mix is Purdue, and then a bunch of teams that are, largely in that 20 to 50 range. So it is a really critical game for Indiana. It's obviously a critical game for Louisville. And it's a little frightening because I think Louisville is clearly better than they were last year when they took Indiana to the final 5 minutes in a neutral site game. This is going to be a really interesting matchup for Indiana because it is the first time they've really played. I can't tell if South Carolina is demonstrably worse than Louisville. It's still kind of up in the air, but it's going to be the first real test, I think, because it's away from Assembly Hall.
I'll put it this way. If you're the Louisville side of this, Louisville thinks they are a much, much better team than South Carolina. And kind of the expectation around Louisville, the expectation from the coaching staff, the players, the fans, all that stuff, Louisville very much expects to be an NCAA tournament team this year. South Carolina, I don't think you could argue the same thing. They're picked second to last in the SEC. They lose Michi Johnson, who goes back to Ohio State. They got some nice pieces, but you can tell they just don't have the guard play that they need to really be successful. So if I'll put it this way, if Louisville plays to what people think they are a much better team than South Carolina, and they play a very distinct style that I think gives Indiana a lot of issues with. They're going to play 5 out. They're going to take Balo Renew away from the paint, and they're going to shoot a lot of 3-pointers, which is something that Indiana has struggled with. Now, Louisville hasn't hit a lot of those 3-pointers so far this year. They're only shooting, I think, 29% from 3, which I think they have better shooters on the team than that number showcases. It's still a small sample size, but at the same time, they haven't hit them yet. and it's a very weird quirk of Louisville shoots a crap ton of 3s. They haven't made a lot of them this year. Indiana's shooting like 35-36% from 3. I think they're 333rd in terms of actual percentage of what they get from behind the arc.
Well, and it's a really good point. Indiana is a better 3-point shooting team this year than they were last year. Last year, they were 32.4% from beyond the arc, and they barely shot any 3s. They were 351st in the country. This year, they are 35.7% from the arc. They're top 105 basically in terms of shooting percentage. They're still not shooting enough threes. They're only shooting threes on 30.4% of total field goal attempts. This is where Indiana fans have gotten concerned. To me, there were two offensive stats that Indiana had, or three offensive stats, I guess, that Indiana had to improve in over last year. One was 3-point rate, one was 3-point shooting percentage, and one was turnover percentage. And they've gotten better in one of those so far, which is 3-point field goal percentage. That's good. It's still not a primary part of the offense. And there's still a hesitancy on the part of IU and Mike Woodson to lean heavily on the three-pointer as part of the menu of what they're doing. Thus far, it has not mattered because none of the teams that they've played are physically imposing enough to keep Malik Renew, Omar Ballo, players, guards and so forth from driving into the lane and scoring in the paint. But you play a team like Louisville, you're going to have to hit threes. You're going to have to shoot them at a higher rate. 4 games is enough of a sample size where it's like, I don't think they're going to suddenly flip a switch and say, hey, we're going to shoot three-pointers on a lot more possessions now. So I do worry. And then you have to add in the fact that they've been shooting in Assembly Hall, which, as you know, is a very unique venue from an angles perspective. Now they're going to go play 3 games in a ballroom in the Bahamas with no depth perception behind you. It looks like you're doing lunar bowling, but it's basketball in there. So that's probably going to affect their percentages in terms of what they're able to hit. I have a tendency to believe they're going to try to lean on the things they think are going to work for them. I'm not sure how well that's going to work going up against so many high-rate three-point shooting teams in the Bahamas.
Yeah, which I worry about it a lot more defensively for Indiana, and I think that's something Louisville can exploit a lot more defensively than I do on the offensive end, because I honestly think Louisville's biggest challenge in this game is how are you going to keep Indiana out of the paint? I mean, this is a Louisville team that got outscored in the paint. I think it was 44-10 against Tennessee, and they've struggled. They've struggled inside. They've struggled keeping teams out of the lane. They've kind of reverted to playing a little bit more, trying to play in the passing lanes, get deflections, get out and transition a little bit more, which has worked for them to a point. Like, they're one of the best turnover creation teams in the country. But on the back end, I look at guys like Malik Renew. They're going to have the opportunity to have a big game in the offensive end. I wonder how Louisville's going to play Indiana on ball screens. Are they going to blitz ball screens? Are they going to try to keep Miles Rice, Trey Galloway out of the lane? I think it's going to be a very interesting thing. But on the flip side, I feel like Louisville could run their base offense, and Indiana's going to do the things we've seen from Mike Woodson for 4 years now, to where they're going to overhelp. They're going to lose guys off the ball. And that plays into everything Louisville wants to do with their spacing, their pace, their movement, to where I don't think it's an outrageous statement to say there's a world where Louisville gets 40 to 45 open shots in this game. And Louisville, despite the percentages, have too many good shooters to give them that, to where if you're looking at how Louisville wins this game, that to me is the blueprint for them.
Oh, I think you're right. And I think it's going to be an interesting, trying to figure out how this parses out in terms of how Indiana decides to play defensively is going to be really fascinating. I don't know how you could look at the stat sheet for Louisville and not be concerned about the fact that they hit so many twos, but that's not a primary part of their offense. The 3 is what they're really trying to get, but that is going to really stretch Indiana's defense. Now, I do think one of the things I said before the season was Indiana's defense had to get better from what it was last year. It was lost in how bad Indiana's offense was the fact that they were only 84th in the country defensively from an efficiency perspective, according to Ken Palm. And a lot of it was what you just described, leaving shooters open when they shouldn't have. And what I get worried about with Indiana, even though they are clearly a more talented team, even though they are clearly a team that's got some new wrinkles that have been put in, I do think that Woodson and his coaching staff deserve credit for that. It's still a work in progress. And Louisville is such a kind of an extreme team in what they try to do statistically. If it doesn't work for Louisville, I think Indiana certainly got enough in the tank on both ends of the ball that they can, or both ends of the court, that they can almost kind of smother what Louisville's trying to do and frustrate them. But if Louisville is able to apply that much defensive pressure, with Indiana really only having one functional ball handler at this point, Trey Galloway's still injured. Miles Rice has been very good, but Rice is out there on an island a lot of times, and the offense is really not designed to help him in situations where he's going to get a ton of pressure. I do worry about how Indiana ramps up in that environment and is able to deal with that type of pressure. On the flip side, though, you know, the offensive firepower Indiana can bring to bear on you. Mbako, Renew, Omar Ballo, Miles Rice. That's a lot of different angles that Louisville's really going to struggle with in terms of trying to defend across the board there. And whatever you want to say about Louisville and their improvement, they're not as good defensively as Indiana is at this point. So Indiana should have some kind of an advantage overall there.
Yeah, I think it's going to be both teams should be able to get what they want offensively. And a lot of it's going to come down to, okay, is Indiana going to be able to feast in the paint like we expect? Are they going to finish plays? Are they going to be able to build enough of an advantage on that end versus Louisville's going to be spraying threes, probably having a lot of open looks, threes more than two, but at what point can Louisville defend Indiana just enough to keep, that points in the paint from being completely insanely lopsided like it was in the Tennessee game, or Indiana just defending the three just well enough for Louisville missing some shots to where that's where the difference in this game could come from. Because I think the turnovers are going to be another big thing. Also, Louisville's top 10, I believe, in turnover percentage in the country. Chucky Hepburn individually is third in the country in turnover percentage defensively. Indiana still does not create a whole lot of turnovers on the other end. How Louisville can create some extra possessions is going to be a big thing. And just the Miles Rice, Chucky Hepburn matchup. Because as you said, Trey Galloway still coming back from the injury. Corin Johnson for Louisville is likely going to miss the game. He's Louisville's big secondary ball handler. U of L goes really positionless. They had Javon Hadley move to the point when Hepburn was out of the game against Winthrop last week. They have a lot of guys that can handle the ball, and I think that's going to be a big key as well. But Rice v. Hepburn, I think we saw Miles Rice really get the better of Zakai Ziegler in the exhibition game at Tennessee, which, looking back on, if you're Indiana, that really sucks for them that does not actually count on the resume, because that is probably going to be the best win they would have all year in or out of conference, unless they upset Gonzaga in Atlantis this weekend. But he was able to win that individual matchup with Zakai Ziegler. When Hepburn and Ziegler went at each other in Louisville a couple weeks ago, Ziegler had his way defensively. Ziegler shot the ball really well. Ziegler also turned the ball over 11 times. It was one of the more bizarre stat lines you have ever seen from a point guard. But how Rice and Chucky Hepburn go at each other, I think is going to be really fun to watch.
Yeah, and I mean, you look at Rice thus far, and he's been really efficient offensively. I think he's shooting 46% from three. He's driven to the basket really well. He's hitting his free throws. I think he's 13 of 14 from the free throw line so far. Like, he's doing all of those things well, but he's got a 26.7% turnover rate. That is really concerning when you're going up against an experienced opponent. And I don't know how he fares in this. Like, have the turnovers really been just an early season kind of we're still getting to know each other thing? If so, we haven't really seen the trend lines change that much. I mean, he's committed at least 2 turnovers in every game, 3 turnovers in each of the last 2. And there's no real help right now. I mean, Trey Galloway has been able to play a little bit more than I anticipated, but he's only playing 45% of minutes. He's been really good in terms of assist rate, but even Trey Galloway's got a turnover rate of almost 30%. So I tend to think, like, there've got to be some tweaks from Mike Woodson and his staff to try to not make this just a player versus player thing. Like, they've got to figure out a way to set up their offense so that they're not leaving their guards on an island, just trying to dump the ball into the post. They've got to have more actions, I think, on the perimeter. They've got to be able to go a little more downhill, and everything about the way that this goes, like, it's almost a coin flip. We've seen IU be able to adjust going into games where they were going to play teams like this, but we've also seen them not. And it's always a little bit of a question mark about how they're going to approach. Are they going to say, we're just going to keep doing what we're doing, or we're really going to make adjustments along the way? I have no idea at this point, and I don't think anybody else does either. There's so much offensive firepower on this IU team, but we've yet to see them really face this type of pressure from a team that's got the athletes that Louisville does. So it's going to be really interesting. I don't think anybody is really going to know until about 5 minutes into the game how Indiana's deciding to attack this and how effective Louisville could be at disrupting it.
How much do you think Trey Galloway plays in this game? Because he's been playing, as you said, like 45% of the minutes. So that's a good amount. He's not playing, 30, 32 minutes a night. You would argue that he doesn't have to do that anymore with Miles Rice. But first game of three games in 3 days. How do you think Mike Woodson handles that?
I think Woodson's tendency is going to be to try to save Galloway a little bit. He's averaging somewhere in the range of, I don't know, 15 to 20 minutes a game. I think he had 22 minutes against South Carolina. I would look for somewhere in that range unless Indiana is really struggling in the ball handling department. And at that point, you might say like, well, gosh, we're going to need the winning is more important than having Trey Galloway necessarily down the line if he's still struggling a little bit. So I would anticipate somewhere in the 15 to 20 minute range, and it's going to be a big load on Miles Rice as a result, because I don't think Gabe Cupps or Ja'Kai Newton, who are the other two kind of ball handlers off the bench, are really going to be able to come in and contribute to that degree. Keenan Carlisle will probably play a decent amount. He's actually been better than everybody else in terms of his turnover rate. He's just not scoring very much. So if you're playing him there and trying to utilize some kind of a setup where you're leveraging him more in the array of things, you're taking some stuff off the table at this point. So Galloway is a big question mark. He's so good. He's seventh in the nation early on in this year in assist rate. He's got a great eye for where the ball is supposed to go, particularly within the confines of this offense. He knows where to put people. Every evidence we've seen so far, though, is that he's going to be somewhat limited in his minutes. You're not going to see him playing 30, 35 minutes in this game.
Right, which I think when Indiana's at their best, it's a lot of the time it's when Galloway and Rice are both on the floor. You got both of those ball handlers. You think back to the South Carolina game when South Carolina started hedging and blitzing those high ball screens late in the game. Took him a minute or two to adjust, but they started short rolling Malik Renew, Umar Ballo. You had Tucker and Mbako cutting from the corners or spotting up for threes. That's something to where I say, okay, you can get some advantages there because Louisville, I think, because of their size disadvantage, is going to have to be uber aggressive. Another thing I think a lot of this is going to come down to is the case in prior Malik Renew quote unquote matchup. I know it's not smart and great to use just individual matchups all the time, but especially since with Abubakar Traore out for Louisville, he has a broken arm. Pryor is going to play a lot more minutes. He's going to play some at the 5 as well. He's top 10 in the country in opponents drawn fouls per game. He's a guy that is incredibly uber aggressive. Louisville initiates a lot of their offense through him because one of the things I talked about in the last podcast with Coach Lieberman was when Indiana's at their best, a lot of what it comes down to is the guards pressuring the ball in the half court, really pushing the opposing offense out, and that's something I think they can have some success against Louisville with. However, Mark Lieberman's response to that was Louisville's pressure release of initiating offense through the bigs, whether it be Case and Pryor or Noah Waterman or using James Scott and a lot of zoom action, dribble handoff actions as well, to where Pryor especially is a guy that can drive downhill with varying degrees of success, to be completely honest. Is a dude, he's just as likely to be 8 for 11 from the field as he is 2 for 12. We just don't know which type of version of him we're going to get. But whether or not he's actually making shots, can Malik Renew and Umar Ballo be able to defend him without fouling is a big question mark, because that's something Malik Renew's really struggled with throughout his career.
I know. No, last year Renew was getting 4.3 fouls called on him per 40 minutes, and hasn't gotten any better this year. He's basically at the same rate. I think as much as we've hoped that Malik Renew would develop into a guy who could defend by moving his feet and not get himself in a position where he's sticking a hand in where he shouldn't, it just hasn't materialized. And with Ballo, Ballo's interesting because he doesn't draw a lot of fouls, but I would also say that he's provided a lot of rim protection so far, and that's been nice. But I don't know with this particular matchup if that's going to be quite as effective given all the things that you just said. So it's going to be a really fascinating test for Indiana, because you kind of get caught in that. This is the type of matchup that I'm always the most interested with Indiana to see how they approach things, because you don't want to slack off into the paint and leave shooters open. You want to be able to defend one-on-one or be able to bring guys over zonally within the driving lanes. But Indiana has struggled sometimes with that because they have been so easy to force into overhelp situations. And if you're clever about how you're doing it, you're going to put Indiana in some disadvantages from a defensive perspective. I think this is where a guy like Bryson Tucker could have potentially some impact because of his athleticism, his ability to move. He could end up being a little bit of a wild card defensively if you are putting him in the right positions. And this is kind of the big question mark for Indiana. Like Mbako's gotten a little bit better defensively, but I'm not in love with what he brings to the table on that front. Carlisle is, obviously he's only 6'3". He's a little bit on the smaller side to be able to defend the type of actions you're talking about. Galloway's injured. So you're kind of left with Ballo, Renew, Tucker, and
Luke Goody.
Luke Goody, but Luke Goody again, that's not a guy you're bringing in for his defensive movement. And thus far, he's really struggled to get his shot going offensively. He's only 3 for 12 from three, and that's really he's supposed to be kind of a three-point specialist. So it's a challenge for Mike Woodson, I think, to game plan something that's going to stymie what Louisville wants to do. I will be really interested to see how he decides to approach it and whether they can maintain that plan throughout the full 40 minutes, given the lack of depth in the types of players you need to effectively defend Louisville.
Right, because that's the big thing, because for about 15 minutes every game, I feel like Indiana looks like a top 10 team in the country right now.
Yeah.
It's what happens in the other 25 minutes where things kind of come crashing down to earth a little bit. But that's the huge thing. The antithesis of the Indiana defense is where Louisville thrives. Is Louisville hasn't proven yet that they can beat people one-on-one against good competition. They just haven't. I mean, they kind of resorted to that in the Tennessee game of trying to dribble one-on-one and drive, and Tennessee quite literally just shut him down on it over and over again. Again, I think Terrence Edwards has to be the type of guy that can do that. Deshaun Pryor a little bit. Chucky Hepburn, you'd give it to you some, but as you know from watching him in the Big Ten the last 3 years, I love Chucky Hepburn's game. He's a great player. He's not the give me the ball and get the bleep out of the way, I'm going to go get you a bucket every time down the floor type of player. To where Indiana has to be disciplined enough to not break into the habits of how they usually play defense. And to be quite frank, I don't trust them to do that. And that's something to where, as someone who grew up a Louisville fan and Indiana grad, I have mixed emotions on that for sure, to be just completely honest. But it's tough to see if you're going to tell me Indiana is going to be disciplined enough to not overhelp on drivers that aren't really much threats to get all the way to the basket. I don't know if I can trust that.
I'm really, this is going to be the big test. And look, this is what Indiana fans have been waiting for. I wish Indiana fans were, and frankly, the players were going into this with a little more established confidence based upon the games that they had played already. I was at the UNC Greensboro game. It felt like things were going well. It's like, great, they're going to ease to victory here. And then the second half happened. And you're just like, wow, this is a recurring nightmare that we can't get out of. And so the fans are, I think, pretty ambivalent about Indiana's ability to do what you just described, which is change fundamentally their mentality on defense in games like this. And it's tough because this is not the game Indiana's coming to the Bahamas excited to play. They're coming, and they should be. This should be the game that they're most interested in. But, the draws are in the next round and the round after that. Are they going to be able to get up for Louisville? And how much is Louisville going to be up for Indiana? Because this is a big gateway game for Louisville. If they win this game, now they get locked into the winner's side of the bracket. And so, look, this is the test through the fire for Indiana all offseason. We've heard this is going to change, that's going to change, we're changing our mentality. And I want to be clear, again, there have been signs that there have been attempts to do that in individual moments. If you take the big picture statistics, they're not really coming through. It does look like last year's team in terms of those items, except for the fact that they're being more efficient on both sides. Will that carry over as they're playing Louisville in this game? I am not going to make any kind of prediction on whether or not it'll happen. I'm as curious as the rest of the fan base is right now.
Yeah, I'll say this. I think Louisville is very locked in on Indiana from the standpoint of how the Tennessee game went, how that was supposed to be the big arrival, the return of Louisville basketball, and then to, get blown out by 22 or whatever the heck it was. This is Louisville's next big chance to kind of prove like, okay, we're on the right track. We're coming back to relevance. Is this Indiana game? And yes, if they win, when you get Gonzaga and all that stuff and you get in the winner's bracket, but Louisville right now is looking to prove they can play with major teams in college basketball. And Indiana, with that number 14 or wherever the heck it's going to be on Monday afternoon, we're recording this Monday morning, wherever they are in the AP poll, this is that next opportunity for them. If they lose this one, they don't get another real chance in the Bahamas. And then it starts to become okay. Because Louisville's schedule, Galen, is incredibly front-loaded.
Yes.
Insanely front-loaded. I mean, they had Tennessee, they have Indiana, the Bahamas. But if you lose this game, then it becomes, okay, can Louisville actually compete with these teams? And you don't have a lot of time to fix things. You don't have a lot of time to improve because you got Ole Miss coming in the ACSC Challenge. The ACC did Louisville no favors with the way they scheduled having Duke come to the Yum Center early December. You have Kentucky at Rupp on December 14th, and you have North Carolina on New Year's Day at home. To where if you're Louisville, they need to be ready now because you're trying to build an NCAA tournament resume. There's not going to be a lot of opportunities after January 1st. There
Yeah.
just isn't in the ACC. So the sense of urgency, the way the Tennessee game went for Louisville, that sense of urgency, I still don't think it quite matches Indiana in terms of importance because I think if Indiana loses to Louisville, you do the bracketology every year, so you can tell me if I'm wrong. I feel like that could be a difference of two seed lines even for Indiana if they lose this game and don't get chances at Gonzaga or Arizona, or if they, things don't go well, if you're on the bubble, that's the type of thing that can keep you out of the NCAA tournament. I don't know if it's that level of importance to Louisville, but if they lose this game, it becomes a big question mark of will Pat Kelsey get that quad one big time statement win that they might need to get in the NCAA tournament.
Yeah, I think that's a real issue. And look, it's the same issue for Indiana, like you said. It is, it's interesting because the ACC and the Big Ten, outside of Duke, who's clearly going to be a top
Right.
five team, they're very similar in that they've got a bunch of teams that are kind of packed between the 20 and 100 range. That will help them in terms of should you get in, but it's probably not going to help very much in terms of where are you seated. And, you figure, the Mississippi game's probably not going to help Louisville that much. The Kentucky game would be huge if they could win at Rupp, but that seems
They
a bit
haven't won at Rupp, Galen, since I was in fourth grade.
which is why I said it
Yep.
seems
Yeah.
but at least if you're Louisville, like you get a chance to play Duke, you get a chance to play North Carolina, albeit those games are at home. And for Indiana, it's a similar kind of issue where you look down the list of games. Your best chance at a top level road win this season, you've got at Ohio State, you've got at Purdue, and you literally don't have anything else on the schedule. Maybe at Oregon, but I have a hard time
Yeah.
believing
I
Oregon's
mean,
still
Purdue at home. I mean, that'll hurt you a little bit with it at home, but
the problem is ultimately from seeding the NCAA, rightfully so. They want to see, can you win on a neutral court? Can you win away from home? Because that's where the NCAA tournament games are played. They're not played on your home court. And we see enough upsets where you're able to beat a good team at home. You get some credit for that. It's like, oh, well, okay, they can beat that team. But I do think from a seeding perspective, when you're going up against teams that do have good neutral court wins or do have good wins away from home, it really leaves you at a disadvantage. Indiana being in the top 25, I think it's almost more imperative to them because I'm not sure if people were really expecting Louisville to make the NCAA tournament this year or not. I'm not sure what the total expectations were, but for Indiana and for Mike Woodson, the expectation was not, oh, you're going to get a 7 seed or an 8 seed or somewhere in that range. It's like we're talking like, second year of Trace Jackson Davis, like top 4 seed, 23, 24 wins. You've left yourself very little pathway to get to those sorts of things if you don't beat Louisville in this game, because if that door slams shut, unless something miraculous happens, like, Gonzaga loses in the first round or something like that, or Arizona ends up in that side of the bracket, you don't have a lot of other options as far as picking up those sorts of wins, even in conference. So I think everybody, when they saw the schedule for Indiana, was like, wow, given how much is on the line this season and given how awkward the relationship is right now between Mike Woodson and most of the fan base, you really didn't give yourself much margin for error. And all it takes is something like Trey Galloway being injured at the start of the season, and suddenly the one chance you have to make some hay in terms of your schedule and your resume, gets endangered. And that really is a concern.
yeah, the other part of it is I don't think we realized during the offseason and in the preseason how unlucky this draw was for the winner of this game to have to play Gonzaga day two, because Gonzaga, I think, is absolutely the best team in the country right now. They are absolutely boat racing people. And it would be very helpful for both Louisville and Indiana to somehow play Gonzaga and Arizona. But Arizona is the team that looks much more beatable, much more winnable of a game. They really haven't impressed so far. I get it. Yes, they just played Duke at home. Like, Duke's a very, very good team, but they also struggled at Wisconsin. Jaden Bradley's been really good, but you're still relying so much on Caleb Love, who's so Jekyll and Hyde. The front court isn't nearly as good as it's been in past year, partially because Umar Ballo is now at Indiana, but that's the team. If it would have drawn to where the winner of this game plays Arizona, yet then you have, I feel like, a much better chance of playing both Arizona and Gonzaga. Now, I'm going to be completely honest. I think whoever wins the Louisville Indiana game gets absolutely boat race day two, and then you're probably playing either Oklahoma or Providence, which is fine. It's a game. It's probably a quad two game. Maybe Providence gets better throughout the year as Bryce Hopkins gets healthier, but it's not the type of statement quad one win that even, if you're Louisville or Indiana, you go 2-1, you get a quad one win in day one that, to varying degrees, we'll see how that ends up playing out for both of these teams. And then you get a borderline quad one, quad two win day three, then you get boat race quad against Gonzaga day two. How much does that really help you?
I mean, if you get two neutral court wins against teams that are going to finish in the top 50 of the net, that's helpful, because again, that is going to be two quad one wins as long as they're in the top 50 on a neutral floor. And the problem is, I think Oklahoma right now they're 47th in Ken Palm, but they're going to be playing this murderer's row of
In the
teams
SEC.
in the in the SEC. Arizona is 2-2. I don't know. We need a congressional investigation into how you let Wisconsin go for 82 possessions. I mean, has that ever
They
happened?
play fast now. It's the wildest thing.
I know, but it feels unnatural. Okay,
It does.
but Arizona's got an even bigger murderer's row because they've got to play in the Big 12. And what you worry about with Arizona is, they're 23rd in Ken Palm. Do they get driven down by the fact, they've got to play Houston, they've got Kansas, they've got Arizona or Iowa State twice, they've got Cincinnati on the road, they've got a lot of games they're going to be really tough, and if they can't defend better against good talent than what they've shown in these last couple of games, even if you beat Arizona, that win perhaps gets devalued. I don't know that Arizona would ever fall out of the top 50, so maybe it's not that big of a deal, but you still have to try to find a way to play them, and that is a very narrow pathway because you don't know what's going to happen in the games that they're playing. Like, is it inconceivable that Arizona could lose to Davidson and be on the loser side of the Atlantis bracket? I mean,
it would be very college basketball.
It would be. I mean, but as you pointed out, like, this is an Arizona team that's not shooting the ball very well from three at this point, and they are, they're moving so fast, but they've yet to beat anybody of quality. They're going to get obviously a little bit of an opportunity here, and Davidson's not that great of a team. But this is why it's so hard to forecast these things. And I guess the larger point I would make, and I think you're making the same thing, is you can't stuff all of your non-conference eggs in a exempt tournament where you don't know what's going to happen in the other games. And Louisville's in a little bit of a different spot than Indiana, simply because of the expectations for Indiana. They're much higher right now, and because Kelsey's still got the first year kind of like, well, we're reorganizing things. It was so bad with Kenny Payne before. I'm not sure that people are going to be mad if Louisville doesn't make the tournament. People are going to be real mad if Indiana doesn't make the tournament. I think they'll make the tournament, but Indiana in a position where they're playing in like the 8-9 game because they didn't have enough quality wins to justify being higher than that is going to be a real tough pill to swallow if that's the scenario. So there's ways to do this, and for Mike Woodson's sake, I just wish they had kind of gone about it a little bit differently in how they tried to set the schedule up, because I just don't know right now if this Indiana team that's still learning to play together, it's a bunch of pieces from a bunch of different spots. One of your core pieces that returned is still injured. It's just a lot to say you got to go in and get some wins against a couple, and you don't even have as many great, competitors in this bracket. And Gonzaga, as you said, looks like they're on fire right now. So it's just a bad combination of events.
Yeah, that's where it would have been really helpful for, I think, everyone involved if Creighton was still in the battle for Atlantis bracket, because I think, well, you got to see now they lost Nebraska at home, and Stephen Ashworth gets hurt in that game, so he's going to be out a little bit. So we'll see how that impacts them. But that would still be a much better, much more quality opponent than, it's nothing against Providence, but it's Providence who struggled with some cupcakes early on this year. A lot of that being Bryce Hopkins not being back. He's making his debut for the season on Wednesday, but we'll see how effective he can actually be. That's just, I think Providence can be a fine team. I think they can be an NCAA tournament team, but it's not the type of game even Creighton without Ashworth would be on your resume. So that's going to hurt. But to me, this season comes all down to, and this is where Louisville is used to talking about and where they want to get back to. But for Indiana, you know, we're not fools. We know where the NCAA tournament games are this year. There's first and second round games in Lexington. There's Sweet 16, Elite Eight games in Indianapolis. This whole season is about, can you get a top 4 protected seed and play in Lexington, then Indy? That is the entire season. Because at that point, you mentioned it, NCAA tournament games are played in neutral road environments. If you're Indiana, or heck, if Louisville went on some magical run this year, I think Louisville could be a tournament team. I don't think they're going to be a top 4 protected seed at this stage. That would be the absolute best case scenario for them. But for either team, you would be playing de facto home games if you get Lexington and Indianapolis. And that is such an advantage, especially for how those two fan bases gather around the basketball programs and support the basketball programs to be playing games that close to home. And when you don't give yourself the opportunity to do that, which Indiana did not, Louisville, to their credit, they go out, they schedule Tennessee at home. They have the ACC SEC Challenge, which they get Ole Miss, which is, I think that could be a solid win, whatever. ESPN they had the opportunity, Galen, to do the funniest thing ever and have Calipari and Kenny Payne in Arkansas go to the upsetter for that game. And I still do not forgive them for not giving us that game, because holy cow, that would be absolutely just insane on so many levels up there with that one. But you have the annual Kentucky game to where you have 3 big opportunities outside of Atlantis to where you could, in theory, win 1 or 2 of them and make Atlantis just kind of icing on the cake. Just things change when you get blown out by Tennessee at home.
Yeah. I mean, and the other thing I'll say is ultimately with Indiana, you have to look at the trend lines of when they've played these sorts of things before. Last year, it was like they had additional opportunities. It wasn't just the Madison Square Garden event that Indiana had to hang their hat on, but they didn't play particularly well in that. They get blown out in the second half by UConn. No shame there. Obviously UConn was the best team in the country last year, but then they struggle with Louisville. They schedule a neutral site game against Auburn. They get obliterated in that game. You and I were both at that one.
Oh, yeah.
They get a chance at Kansas at home, and that wasn't even that strong of a Kansas team, as we found out, and they blow the game in the last 5 minutes. And you end up walking out of that non-conference with your best win from a numbers perspective being a 1-point game against Morehead State that you had to hit a shot towards the end to win. And it is kind of baffling to me, with a better team under him this year, that Woodson didn't schedule a tougher non-conference schedule. Now, they got a lot of the awful teams out there. They're only playing, I think, 3 teams that are sub 200 in Ken Palm, and they deserve credit for that. They've raised the floor of what their opponents are, but then they've already had a game in UNC Greensboro where they didn't win by their expected margin, which ends up dragging them down in the metrics, and we know with the net that hurts. So they've loaded so much into this game, and I just don't totally understand what the thought process was. And look, there's nothing you can do about it now, but you just brought up a whole string of great points. The tournament and tournament success, which is what IU fans are hungry for, like IU
and Louisville fans too,
and Louisville fans too. Yeah. But IU fans have, I would argue, they've gone longer without any sort of demonstrable tournament success. Yeah. It's been what now 8 years since they made the Sweet 16, and there's been this buildup where even with a guy like Trace Jackson Davis, you could only get to the second round. You put yourself in a position where you've added additional pressure, and now you're basically asking your team to go and play a perfect 3 days over Thanksgiving to give yourself the wins that you need to be able to say to the committee in March, we deserve to be up at a level, not just where we have a higher seed, but as you said, we're in a geographically favorable area. You can go elsewhere and win in the tournament, no question. But if you can play well enough and get things on your resume to make it easier on yourself in that environment, you should do it. And
Yeah.
so, it's hard for me with you bringing in Miles Rice and Omar Ballo and Carlisle and reshaping this roster in the way that Woodson tried to, why there wasn't more of an effort, at least maybe around Christmas. I could understand maybe not doing it around, in the first month of the season. But if you've given yourself a month and a half to get things up and running, why not have an equivalent of that Kansas game or an equivalent of that Auburn game during that time period? Because if this crumbles the wrong direction, you won't get a chance to play any teams that are in the top 25, and that is going to hurt you come selection time.
Absolutely. I mean, you look at it, like if Indiana were to draw the 4 seed or Louisville like a 6 seed in the South Regional this year, you play in Atlanta. As much as I would personally love that living in Atlanta now having the games 10 minutes from my apartment, and I have to be completely honest, I've already taken the days off work so I could go to those games in Atlanta. It would be much more beneficial to be playing in Indianapolis. That would be a much harder thing for an opponent to face in an NCAA tournament mindset. And on just kind of the type of teams, I would almost rather play the teams in the 300s in KenPom than the UNC Greensboros or Louisville playing Winthrop, because we saw it for both times. You can't struggle with them like Indiana did so many times last year, and against the armies and so on and so forth. The Wright States, I think it was. But if you're able to blow those teams out by 35, 40 points, that does more for you than playing a team with a pulse like UNC Greensboro or Winthrop that we saw can take a punch in
Yeah.
both of those games and come back and be competitive and be good. While that might actually help you out a little bit better playing some better competition, it's going to hurt you more in the metrics.
And I think the problem for Indiana, and probably why they're not scheduling those teams, is that they just haven't shown the ability to be consistent enough in their play to blow those teams out. They did it against Eastern Illinois. They won that game by 35 points. But, they only beat SIU Edwardsville, who's not very good, by 19. They struggle with UNC Greensboro, who's better. They're one of those kind of 150
Right.
to 250 teams that you're talking about. But, you look at the metrics, Indiana is not, I mean, they're favored by 22 and a half, 19 and 20.3 according to Torvik against Miami, Chattanooga, and Winthrop, which are kind of like the worst teams remaining on the schedule. And there'll probably be situations there where, maybe they're not going to win by that margin. And I say that just because that's what we've seen out of this team so far the last couple of years. And so I just worry about it with Indiana. Are they going to get better? Probably. They're better already. As I said, they're playing better defensively. They're more efficient offensively. But you have to put that in the context of how poor they were in both those metrics last year. Like, they've taken leaps. They're 60 spots higher in offensive efficiency through the first 4 games. They are something like 40 spots higher in defensive efficiency over the course of the first 4 games. But that is only getting them into the echelon where they're, probably 7th, 8th, 9th in the Big Ten in terms of their overall efficiency numbers. You look at what they're projected right now on Torvik, they're projected to go 19 and 10 and 11 and 9. And
Indiana fans would not be happy with that.
no, and nor should they be.
Yeah.
And what worries me, again, in the context of the schedule, is that right now they are underdogs in a bunch of road games, and they are going to need those road games to try to distinguish their resume. I mean, right now, they're an underdog at Nebraska in a couple of weeks. That's not a great Nebraska team. I mean, that's a Nebraska team that's trying to reform itself on the fly with the roster issues that they've had. There's a lot here that could go wrong for Indiana. They're going to have to thread the needle in a bunch of different ways in terms of how they play. I on the one hand, I think I understand what the basic idea of the scheduling was like, but I don't think it's working in practice, especially with what we've seen in the limited sample size so far for IU, with the caveat that could certainly change as we move forward.
Yeah, and I'd add this too. You talk about 19 and 10. Indiana fans would not be happy with 19 and 10. Louisville fans, I think, would be more acceptable with that this year, given the circumstances. But you brought it up earlier. Indiana's had this kind of slow decline the last 25 or so years, whereas Louisville just fell completely off a mountain. It feels like to where Louisville hasn't made the second weekend. You said Indiana hasn't made it since the Yogi Ferrell team in 2016. Louisville hasn't made it since 2015. They've won one tournament game in the last decade. For
I'll be honest, I
yeah,
didn't realize it had been that long. As soon as I said that, I
yeah.
looked it up. I was like, oh, that's not good.
Yeah, it's wild because someone like my age who grew up during the heart of the Rick Pitino era, Louisville made the second weekend 7 times in a decade between 2005 and 2015. You would roll out of bed and just assume you're in the Sweet 16 every year. So it's a very thing that a lot of people in Louisville took for granted, and I don't think people realize how damn hard that is every year. Gonzaga is on that run right now where they're in the Sweet 16 every year. But to go from that, and then obviously the heights of the Denny Crum era, to not making a second weekend in a decade and having one NCAA tournament win in a decade, and that was in 2017 against Jacksonville State, and one NCAA tournament game since 2017. Louisville it's not fair to Pat Kelsey. And this is something that I said when he took the job. This is something he needs to understand the sense of urgency there is from Louisville fans. They're not expecting a Final Four or anything like that, but because Louisville hasn't had this NCAA tournament success, because they haven't made the NCAA tournament at all since COVID started, that he is walking into this pressure packed of we want to win, we need to win. We know you weren't here for all the BS, but it's your job to clean it up and do it immediately. And to Pat Kelsey's credit, he has realized that and said, we're here, we're going to try to win now. He's scheduled aggressively to reflect that. And now it comes down to, can he actually do it on the court? He's got a lot of transfer, a lot of really good players. How do they all mesh together? Those are all questions. But for Louisville, there is a lot of pressure to maybe not make the NCAA tournament, but at bare minimum, they need to be on the ball. They need to be fighting. They need to have some meaningful games in some way, shape, or form in late February and March to give the fan base, okay, we're going in the right direction here.
Yeah, no, and it's interesting on the Indiana front because I almost feel like with Louisville, and this is just from an outsider's
Yeah.
perspective, you're the expert here, but with everything that happened at the end of Pitino and then the additional kind of what the hell is going on issues with the Adidas thing and then with the Chris Mack situation, it's like there have been clear reasons why they haven't made the tournament and why the program's gone off the rails. It doesn't feel like there's as clear of a reason why Indiana has not been better over the course of this time. It's been bad hires. In the case of Archie Miller, that clearly did not work out. And it's just been this consistent mediocrity, I would say, with the one exception of Woodson's second year. But even that, it's like, they make the second round that year. They're a 4 seed, but they get blown out in the Miami game and, in the second half of the second half. And that team finished 30th in Ken Palm. You go through the list since that 2016 Sweet 16 that IU had. They have not had a year where they finished better than 30th in Ken Palm, which is not a great place to be because you're winning some games, but you're losing games that you shouldn't win. You're not playing very efficiently, and it's not just a Mike Woodson problem, but my philosophy on this stuff, Jack. I don't believe in program. I'll point to Indiana football as an example of this. Like, if you make a hire who can get the program pointed in the right direction quickly, it very quickly illustrates that it's not the program's problem. It's the coaching. It's the overall architecture of how the program is being put together, which is why I guess with Louisville, it's like, somebody keeps firebombing the establishment, which causes the coaches to have the problems that they've had, and then you end up hiring people that you shouldn't, and it kind of just feeds on itself. With Indiana, Crean had lost the plot in recruiting and had lost the control of the roster. Miller, I don't know what the hell he thought he was doing, but it never worked, and his recruiting choices were poor, and the way that he chose for the team to play didn't work. Woodson is demonstrably better than Miller in some ways, but Miller never had as bad of a season statistically as Woodson's season was last year. So, if you're an Indiana fan, it's like, well, gosh, we made the tournament 2 years in a row under Woodson, but then took a huge step back. And now you have to take the same huge step forward to get back to where you were in the first 2 years, which is not what IU fans were told was going to happen or felt like was going to happen.
That's why Indiana fired Crean, because of the inconsistencies.
Right. And so when you go all the way back to the year after IU was the 1 seed in 2013. Their Ken Palm numbers exceed 30 once, and that was 2016. It's just been like a morass of, hey, talented players, good individual moments in some of those seasons where you win a game that you didn't think you were going to. But then there's always the letdown. There's always the, well, we didn't execute. And that's kind of what this Atlantis tournament
Yeah.
feels like for IU in advance. It's like, does anybody really think they're going to go in and win the tournament? If they do, that's amazing. And maybe that's the catalyst they need to pump themselves into the echelon of the top 15, top 20 teams in the country. But right now, they just feel like a team that's kind of permanently on the outside of that. And I think that's why there's the ambivalence that you feel from the IU fan base right now. People don't want to dislike Mike Woodson. People don't want to dislike the team, but they keep waiting for the trigger mechanism for the team to look like a really good basketball team, especially with the success that Purdue's had up the road, especially with UConn being arguably in a worse position and being able over the course of a 4 or 5 year period to turn themselves into the dominant team in college basketball. IU fans are looking around being like, why not us? And they keep not getting a great answer as to why not us, I think.
How much has, because I know the Louisville, Kentucky dynamic is very well documented both nationally and on this podcast and all that stuff, but the Indiana Purdue dynamic, how much added pressure is there that you said? Because I feel like it's a very, because I've obviously been very close to both sides of it, but it's a very different dynamic than the Louisville, Kentucky. We're going to beat each other up in a dialysis center type of deal.
Right.
Deal to where
It's not the same, and this is I've always said I feel like there's more venom between Indiana and Kentucky than there is between Indiana and Purdue, because at the end of it all, unless you are from Southern Indiana as an IU fan, the majority of IU fans are from Indiana or from parts further north, or they're from out of state. Purdue people are just kind of like you in a lot of ways. There's a cultural similarity there. Purdue's been feeling their oats lately. They have clearly been the better program over the course of the last decade or so. Matt Painter deserves a ton of credit for taking what is not a naturally easy job to consistently be at such a high level at, and turning it into a program that can do that. I mean, that all that credit goes to him, much like when Gene Cady had Purdue going at their highest levels there between about 1985 and about 1999,
yeah.
2000, even all the way up to 2000. They almost made the Final Four in 2000. It is unusual because Purdue doesn't have the same recruiting base. They certainly don't have the same fan base in terms of the total number or the financial support. Indiana, I think if Purdue had won the national title this past year or the year before, maybe we're talking about something different. But it just kind of feels like that was Purdue's best shot at winning a national championship. They didn't do it. And in the back of Indiana fans' minds, I still don't think they take Purdue entirely seriously. And to be fair, Indiana's played Purdue really well over the course of the last few years, even in games where they probably shouldn't have been that competitive. Last year, obviously, was an exception. They got blown out in both of those games. But the previous year, they beat Purdue twice, in a season where they were a national title contender. The year before that, they split with them. They've been able to play, at least over the course of the last couple of years, Purdue pretty close, despite Purdue having such a systematic advantage. So it's not the same dynamic. It's not, I've got friends who grew up in, as Louisville fans or Kentucky fans, and I've talked with them about it. It's just not the same feeling. People get hyped up internally for that game, that Indiana Purdue game, whenever it happens. And then it just kind of goes back to neutral corners. It's not like a blood feud, at least not. And
Louisville, Kentucky's a blood feud.
I grew up in West Lafayette as an IU fan. I had to deal with those folks like my entire childhood. But even that, when you see other rivalries that are really fired up, it's different. And I will say it used to be different in the 80s and early 90s when both of these programs were at their apex. We've had this weird thing going now really since the mid 90s where either one is dominant and the other is mid or bad or vice versa. And I think that has harmed the level of vitriol in the rivalry, because the games, while heavily contested and certainly important for bragging rights, generally just haven't mattered that much in the big scheme of things.
Yeah, I mean, like, I know Thanksgiving's always a fun one before the football game, but like it's all about the basketball. That's what it is. But I mean, I know people from Louisville that will not watch the Louisville Kentucky game until Louisville actually beats Kentucky because they can't because they can't they boil over too much. I know I've seen, my dad will not go to the Louisville Kentucky game because he said there's too many fights and too much hatred that breaks out, which is
I
just
mean, yeah,
hilarious.
I
It's
mean,
nuts.
I've been to Mackey when
Yeah.
when I use beating them. No one's ever threatened to beat me up. Purdue fans have come to Assembly Hall and they've beaten Indiana, and they'll be loud in the concourse, but everybody just walks off and does their own thing. So yeah, it it's because to some degree it's a Central Indiana rivalry between Purdue and Indiana, whereas like Indiana Kentucky is a lot closer to Indiana Louisville. It's one of the reasons why the teams haven't played in quite a
Yeah.
while, and because for Kentucky maintaining a feeling of superiority over Indiana is like part of the DNA of the program. And
That's
I
part
think
of the DNA that Kentucky has superiority over everyone. That's what they always feel like.
exactly, and so it is a really fascinating thing to think about. But yeah, it's just a very different kind of dynamic.
Let me ask you, I want to ask you something about the Indiana Louisville series, but before we get there, it's already at this spot, anyways. Indiana, Kentucky obviously being added back on the schedule next year. There's been so much over, where to play the game and all that stuff. The one thing, and this comes as the guy from Louisville saying this, of course. Do you know where Indiana, Kentucky have played more than anywhere else?
Freedom Hall.
Freedom Hall.
Yeah.
I mean, I get it. And I get Freedom Hall's not exactly in the best shape right now, but I look at Oklahoma, Texas in the Cotton Bowl and the way they have refurbished. I mean, they just announced like a bunch of new renovations for that and all that point to where they have said we are making this around the Cotton Bowl every single year in the Cotton Bowl. Louisville is an hour 50 minutes from Bloomington. It's an hour 15, hour 20 minutes from Lexington. I get a lot of it has to do with U of L's crappy deal with the Yum Center to where, UK can't play in the Yum Center unless it's against Louisville or an NCAA tournament game, which that's not U of L's fault. That's the city of Louisville for making a really bad deal with U of L on but I've never understood why there wasn't any angle of why it was always home courts or Indianapolis. Why
Yeah.
not be in the middle and play a true 50-50 split in Louisville?
Well, look, when I was growing up, so when in the 70s and early 80s, it was generally home and home. It was Assembly Hall and Rupp Arena. I love how on a podcast previewing Indiana Louisville, we're talking about the Indiana Kentucky rivalry. This is perfect.
Yeah.
But around 87, 88, somewhere in that range, Indiana was every year playing Kentucky, Louisville, and Notre Dame. And that was a lot of fun. And they would generally rotate the Kentucky site where it was the Hoosier Dome / RCA Dome, or it was Freedom Hall. And that rotation lasted through most of the 90s. And then the teams stopped playing each other. They started again. And the home and home, I think, was very inconvenient for both John Calipari and Tom Crean. Both of those guys being so image conscious did not want to have a situation where they had a bunch of fans in a neutral site venue and then they lost the game. And it was convenient for both of them to say, we'd rather not play this game. And, IU fans blame Calipari for insisting it be, done a certain way. Kentucky fans blamed Indiana and Fred Glass, like talking about it needs to be a home and home, whatever. To be frank, I agree with you. It needed to be in a neutral site rotation. You could have easily done, either Gainbridge and, the Yum Center or something like that. That's the history that I grew up with these two programs. I just think at some point Kentucky was like, there's no point in us playing this game, and we're certainly not going to play it on Indiana's terms where we're having to play at Assembly Hall because that is a decided advantage. It doesn't really cost Indiana anything to go into Rupp Arena and lose. It costs Kentucky a significant amount to go into Assembly Hall and lose. And so to me, I think that was really the calculus. But yeah, I have no problem with this being like make it a two neutral sites, home and away, or just make it neutral sites. People will go to the games. They'll fill it up. It'll be a great environment. I don't see the problem with that.
You brought it up with those games in the '90s, the old Big Four Classic with Indiana, Louisville, we're tying Louisville back into it now as well. Well, Kentucky and Notre Dame. It's a little bit more difficult now that Notre Dame's in the ACC with Louisville, to where you couldn't do those four like that again. But maybe if you were to replace them with Purdue and have Louisville play Purdue, Kentucky play Indiana, just flip flop them and play that in Indianapolis every year. I
Yeah.
think with those four fan bases, because I am incredibly pro like play the games on campus. There's no reason why Ohio State and Texas should be playing a game on Monday night, the night before election day, in front of absolutely nobody in Las Vegas. It's idiotic. But if you're going to play a neutral site game, make it make sense. Like, why are Louisville and Indiana playing in the Bahamas? Louisville and Indiana have played 6 out of the last 10 years, and only 2 of those games have been on campus.
Yeah.
More games have been in either New York City or the Bahamas than they've been in the state of Indiana or the state of Kentucky. It's stupid. It's absolutely insane. Why not, if you're going to do a neutral site game, do it at Indy, do a Big Four type thing. But why don't we get these two programs playing on on campus in the Center or in Assembly Hall, where the environment's going to be way, way better than playing in a ballroom in the Bahamas or 95% empty Madison Square Garden, because everyone's there for the UConn game that's coming up next.
Now, I'm with you 100%. These two programs, Kentucky could certainly make the argument. I think that this argument is ended now that Calipari is no longer there. But you're in an era of college basketball where the idea that you're just going to be above and beyond everybody else and only going to schedule like, Duke and North Carolina or whatever regularly, it's probably not a great argument anymore. And I look at it from the perspective of the conferences are so big. I understand that it is a concern to schedule like the same opponents over and over again. But that to me is what made college basketball a lot of fun for many, many years, was that you knew you were going to play Louisville every year. You knew you were going to play Kentucky every year. You knew you were going to play Notre Dame. And yes, those programs would ebb and flow in terms of quality, but this is what we've lost essentially by having 20-game conference schedules, by having exempt tournaments that take up a certain amount of the non-con, by having coaches who are like, well, we don't want to have a situation where we could potentially have locked into our schedule teams that are really, really good every year. Or ironically, in the case of these three teams that Indiana would historically play, locked in teams that suck. I mean, if you imagine if you needed a non-conference opponent that was of high quality, but you'd had to schedule Louisville every year because you had a regular series with them over the past several years. And and now you've only got a small number of slots to schedule other teams. So I do get it, but it's just a shame because it's just not that compelling. And as you said, whether you're playing in the Bahamas or whether you're playing in New York, which I think Louisville and Indiana have played in New York more times than they played on their respective home floors against each other.
3 times in the last decade.
It's like there's got to be better ways to go about doing this. And I know coaches and schedule makers and athletic directors have a lot on their plate, and they're really mostly focused on a year-by-year thing. But this is how you start to lose the emotional connections that fans have with the programs and the way that they interact with each other, especially with two rivals that are so close geographically.
Do you consider Louisville and Indiana quote-unquote rivals from that?
I mean, I do internally. If I had to like rank Indiana, like what are your non-conference rivals? Kentucky is number 1. Louisville's number 2, I think. Like who's the other option there? And this is where I've always been like, I wish Indiana. I loved what Bob Knight did with the scheduling in the 80s and 90s because they played Kentucky regularly, but they played Louisville regularly as well. They played Notre Dame as well. They started a series with Cincinnati, in like 91, and they played them on a consistent basis.
That was the height of the Bob Huggins era too.
Yeah,
Cincinnati.
Yeah. I would have loved it if they'd, started a series with Xavier. I was excited when they played. I went over to that Xavier game a couple of years ago. What a great environment and what a great battle between two schools that are 2 hours apart from each other. But I don't know that Indiana has a lot of built-in rivals at this point. Louisville, due to the fact that, they won 2 national titles around the same time Indiana won their 2 national titles in the 80s. You've got fans living in the same neighborhoods, in the same cities. that are fans of both of those programs in Southern Indiana and around Louisville itself. We get so many Louisville people that go to Indiana, you being one of them. I mean, I have so many Louisville kids in my program here. I can't even keep track
We
half
got to
the
keep
time.
the pipeline going, baby.
Yeah. But it's, I don't know how you, from a historical perspective and from just a cultural context perspective, I don't know how you wouldn't call Louisville a rival, but they've played so infrequently and the games have been so weird in terms of the relative quality of the teams that they don't look like rivals on paper right now.
Right, because like in my lifetime, for instance, again, they've played on campus twice in the last couple decades. I mean, I vaguely remember when they played in 2003. Louisville won, I think it was 95-76. I can remember that game vividly, which if you ever want to watch an old game that's just completely weird, that was I forget there was some type of NASA mess up. Something bad happened to where they didn't air the game live. So CBS aired it the next day on tape delay. There just was no commentary. So you
Right.
just got the pure, Freedom Hall going absolutely berserk at that point. And you can see a little like 6-year-old me in the front row in the second half of that game. That game going nuts, which is
Go
funny.
back and check the tape. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
That's funny.
I was wearing a Reese Gaines jersey at that point, but they're so close, but they never played to where like I grew up kind of being able to root for both teams and not have it be any sort of an issue because they never played. And I personally, I love it when they play each other because there's no two teams I follow more than them, with Kentucky being a very, very close third to where I can break down the games. I can see do what we've done for an hour and 15 minutes now and really dig deep into both of these teams. I love it.
It's
But
it is really odd. I mean, they've only played 20 times in their history.
yeah,
And they've got these two huge gaps. They played in the 0203 season, which was like the last halfway decent Mike Davis season until the year that he got fired. And then they didn't play again until that game at Madison Square Garden in 2014. They played pretty much every year from 87 through 93 and then didn't play each other for a decade. Prior to that game that they played in the winter of 84, they hadn't played each other since 1960. It's odd, and I think to some degree both programs have probably said to themselves, for a variety of reasons, it makes less sense for us to play each other than it does for both of us to play Kentucky. And that may be part of the mentality that's gone into it. But a lot of it, I think, also is like Louisville didn't have a great later part of the 90s, and then Indiana didn't have a great latter part of the 2000s. And if you don't have to play a team, it does make sense to maybe break it off a little bit. I've been excited that they played as much as they played over the course of the last decade or so. I just wish it happened more often because it feels like there's a tie there that should be enhanced. I think both teams get something out of the game at this point. Indiana is, from a national stature perspective, just not the same program that it was 30 years ago. And Louisville certainly isn't the same program that they were 15 years ago. So maybe they're looking at it and saying this will not boost our individual reputations, so why do it? But I'm glad they're doing it a little bit more.
yeah. Which I wonder, like, what's it benefit them more though, to play this game or to go out and play TCU or someone like that? That either one of these teams has scheduled TCU recently, but just when you're trying to fill in, say, okay, where are we going to get the big games here? It's such an easy, especially if we did it on campus, to where I know a lot of Louisville people that when they played up in Assembly Hall in 2018, 2019, whatever year it was, that said, great, I get a chance to go see this really historic venue. I know if they played at the Yum Center, there'd probably be a lot of, Indiana people that'd say, cool, we get to make a short drive down to Louisville, play downtown Louisville. You could, drink on Whiskey Road, do whatever you want, and get to do all the bourbon stuff. Like, I think it's just beneficial for both schools and for both fan bases to get that game not just played, but played more on campus to where, you can get as much as, Louisville fans wouldn't like a large amount of Indiana fans at the Center and vice versa at Assembly Hall. It's a very manageable, fun, easy game for both schools to have their fans go to the road game out of that.
Yeah, the only thing I can think of is that recruiting has caused a lot of this lack of scheduling because they may be looking at the players they're going after, and we've seen it with some of the players that have been in the mix and saying, well, we'd rather not have the direct comparison that players can make by watching our two programs play each other directly. We'd rather keep them guessing on that to some degree because that can have an impact on who you're able to bring in, who's considering your program versus the other program. It's a
You
consideration. I
see,
certainly understand.
you say that though, but who do Indiana and Louisville think themselves as? They think of themselves as, the borderline blue bloods of, being on par, whether it's factual or not, which lately for both schools it hasn't been.
Yeah, right.
But both schools want to be on that same echelon as the Kentuckys, the Dukes, the Kansases, the North Carolinas, all the UConns, all those schools. And when you do that, perception wise, what teams are you going to have to battle for recruits? Those schools. What teams do Indiana and Louisville want to be playing?
Right.
Kentucky, Duke, Carolina, Kansas, Gonzaga, in the Bahamas this week, to where I would say they would want the exposure of playing those big name schools. And the way Louisville and Indiana think of themselves, they want to be on that upper echelon and be battling with those teams both on the court and in the recruits.
Right. No, I mean, every time I try to logically consider how this should be going, there's things like you just said that make me say, well, maybe that's not actually what's happening. I I'm sure there are reasons, and maybe there's reasons we don't know about. And I'm sure, for Indiana, perhaps they look at it as like we don't perceptionally think we want to uplift Louisville into looking like they're in the same echelon, which is ironic given Louisville's had, I mean, the NCAA would claim they haven't had more recent success, but certainly everybody saw the success. But I can't tell you for sure what the mentality is. It just feels like a nice place to start as both of these brands start to build themselves, hopefully back up to the point where they are regular top 25 programs. I think they'd get a lot more out of playing each other than not playing each other.
Yeah, I viewed the two programs kind of as peers and kind of the same group. I mean, NCAA, non-NCAA, whatever, Louisville, 3 national titles, 10 Final Fours, Indiana, 5-8. Pretty similar, like if you're power ranking the top NCAA basketball programs. I know everyone that's listening to this Kentucky is first. I'm sorry, guys. They are. Then, North Carolina, Kansas, Duke, UConn, kind of it all flows over. UCLA is the weird myriad of whatever the heck they want. But right after that, it's some form of Louisville and Indiana and Louisville. Those are the next two, 6, 7, whatever order you want to put them in. There's not really anyone behind that you're going to argue in front of them. I don't think you can argue that they're better than UCLA or UConn or any of that stuff, the way it's gone for them, to where I think as both programs try to restore back to that prominence, that could be a really good matchup to kind of be that peer and kind of be a litmus test for them.
Yeah. I mean, it's going to be fascinating what both of these programs do moving forward. I mean, I feel like Louisville is on, we'll see how Pat Kelsey does, but it feels like they're starting to formulate a new strategy coming out of the Kenny Payne era. Like what's our 5-year plan? Where do we want to get to? With Indiana, I'm really curious. I mean, is how long is Mike Woodson on the bench, and what is the trajectory of the program? I've appreciated Mike Woodson's efforts to try to schedule tougher and get tougher non-conference opponents. Obviously, it hasn't worked out this year, but the past couple of years, he deserves a lot of credit for adding Kansas to the schedule, for playing Auburn, for playing Arizona on a neutral site, for going and playing UConn, and yet I do think that there's some benefits that you could get from playing those types of games in your backyard. It's the we have McDonald's at home of college basketball scheduling. And so I'm curious now if Louisville can get back up off the mat after a very difficult last couple of years and become a consistent top 40 team. Does that make it more palatable for Indiana to say, let's schedule each other? Because that would get Louisville to kind of where Indiana is at right now. And then the question is, well, do you want to play your peers, or do you want to play more aspirational games? There's benefits and drawbacks to both.
Right. Which my argument is I think you can play both your peers and take a couple shots at, the Kentuckys, the UConns, all that stuff. Before we get out of here, just got to ask you, what do you think is going to happen Wednesday? Who you got?
I don't know. I mean, look, so
that's where I'm at too.
I mean, well, here's the thing. Mike Woodson, and I said this on Inside the Hall at the beginning of the year. I don't think Woodson handled the last part of the season particularly well in terms of the way he communicated with the fan base. And whether or not the criticisms of Woodson were entirely fair, whether or not he was right about, look, we lost our point guard, we didn't really have adequate backup, things went wrong in terms of X, Y, and Z. The last thing you want to do as a coach is create a mentality among the fan base that somehow you don't appreciate them and their support. And even though Woodson has tried to make some amends, that has been the taste that's been left in the mouth of a lot of IU fans. And that goes up higher in the echelon of fan like slash donor lists than people may realize. And so much was riding on this team being demonstrably better on the court because they were demonstrably better on paper. And so that's where a lot of what I think happens with Woodson will hinge on what happens in the Bahamas, because this is your one chance in a environment that is not affected by Big Ten play, where you can show what you've been working on in the off season. I think that what worries me, and you've seen this, Jack, when the fan base, well, anywhere, and it's not just an IU thing. IU fans, I think, get blamed a lot for what other fan bases react normally to. But when the fan base at IU starts to feel like it's not working with a coach, it's really hard to turn that tide. We saw it with Crean. Crean had burned so much capital in 13-14 and 14-15. They got off to a bad start in 15-16. They lost a couple of games out in Maui. IU won a Big Ten title that year. People didn't really jump on board with that season until like the end of February, when it was, because everybody kept expecting the other shoe to drop. And even winning a Big Ten title and getting to the Sweet 16, Crean had done so much damage to his reputation among the fans that they were ready to jump off the boat at the end of December of the following year. And that's exactly what happened. And then he ends up getting fired at the end of the year. Archie never got the fans on board with him, never really had that many special moments. And even the special moments they had were excruciating. The win at Michigan State, I think that first year, the win that they had at home, I think the following year against Wisconsin in overtime. I mean, these were games that they won, and it's like, that's great, but it was never joyful. And then they collapse at the end of the year. He gets booed, at Gainbridge Fieldhouse in the Big Ten tournament, and it's like suddenly it's over. And there was such optimism with Woodson those first 2 years, because like people gave him a mulligan on the first year, and that might have been his best coaching job. If you look at the numbers, like they finished the highest in Ken Pom. They were 28th in the country. They had one of the best defenses in the country. They beat Purdue. When Purdue was I think a number one or in the top five.
They were fourth, year, I believe.
They were fourth, yeah. Then the next year, they underachieved a bit, I think, compared to the talent they had, but they beat Purdue twice. They make the tournament as a protected seed. There was a lot to celebrate. And Woodson, I feel like he's not managed the expectations of the fan base in the way that would make it clear that he's going to be here for the long haul. I don't know how IU handles this internally. I don't know what the internal expectations are of the season, but I do know in terms of the fans and their perception, this ambivalence, and I've been to the last two home games, it's a weird environment in Assembly Hall right now, Jack. Like no one feels really engaged. And I've talked to, I'm like, am I imagining this? And I've talked to a lot of friends who have said the exact same thing to me. And I think it's people want to love this team. They want to love Woodson, but it's just felt like a letdown, even in spite of the successes that they've had. And that's a tough intangible that's hard to get turned around in college basketball.
Yeah, I would say once you lose the coach, or the fan base loses the coach, it's you never truly get it back. We saw that, you mentioned it with Crean and Archie. I would argue that Wisconsin double overtime game my senior year, which was the 2019-20 season, might be the least amount of fun I've ever had at a basketball game that was actually competitive and the team I wanted to win won. It was dreadful. It was terrible. And I know Louisville and Kentucky fans have felt the same way, not really with Kenny Payne, because that just was a massive failure from the start. And there was only one little iota of people that could do Kenny Payne could do literally anything and they would still defend Kenny Payne. And that's another thing. But like Chris Mack is a better example of once things kind of went downhill, he never really got it going again. I mean, like even he had them at number one in the country late in 2019, as in calendar year, December. They lose that game to Texas Tech. They lose to Kentucky in overtime, and then they lose at home to Florida State. They're sitting there something like 14-3. They're eighth in the country, and people are pissed off at Chris Mack. And even from that point, like that was a team, the tournament got canceled that year. They would have been a 3 or a 4 seed. They had that team could have made a Final Four. They could have lost in the first round. It was very heckler's out a little bit, but you could tell from that point on, even when they had some success at the start of the next year before that season kind of fell apart and they missed the tournament, they had never really gotten it all back on that front. And then Kentucky, John Calipari, we all know what happened happened there as well. It's very hard once you lose the fan base to fully get them back.
And it's too bad because like IU objectively finished the season well last year. You know, they beat Wisconsin and Michigan State at home, you know, in that last stretch that kind of got them in a position where they might have been able, if they hadn't had such terrible efficiency numbers, to contend for an at-large bid. You know, they pulled themselves out of a tailspin. But the fans at that point were toast. Like they were done. It's like you don't go and lose by 9 at Penn State or get blown out by 15 at home versus Nebraska or lose at home to Northwestern again. You know, it feels like every time something good happens with IU, where IU fans should celebrate, their minds immediately go to, well, that's great. Let's see them do it again because we've been burned before when we've gotten excited about Indiana doing X, Y, or Z. It's tough. I really, really hope for Indiana basketball's sake, for Mike Woodson's sake, that they play well in Atlantis, that the program gets the fans fully behind it again. It's just a really awkward spot. It's not openly hostile, but it does feel, much as we saw in that 2016-17 season with Crean, if they stumble here and they don't do anything of note and then they, you know, lose the first couple of games they play in the Big Ten or get off to a poor start there, it could start to get ugly, and I don't think anybody wants that.
Right. That's where if you have whether it be Indiana or Louisville in this case, that's to kind of bring everything full circle. You got to do some work now to give yourself a chance to get hot late. And that's, you know, I remember we had this conversation after the Indiana Auburn game in Atlanta, and I think it applies to both these schools at this point. After Indiana got boat race from Auburn, we had the conversation of, look, if they don't beat Kansas, they could be toast here because of, you know, there weren't a lot of big wins in the Big Ten. They hadn't done anything to non-con, and that's kind of what ended up happening, which I still apologize. We got to get you back down here to get some of the wings from the local. Because that was,
I mean, I'll just sign up. Let's do a tour. Yeah. I'm up for it, man. I mean, I was down there for Bourbon and Beyond, you know, so it's not that far. Or, I'm sorry, Atlanta.
Atlanta. Yeah, I'm down Atlanta.
I got to get to Louisville too, as well, but I got to get down to Atlanta. Well, you know what? When IU football's playing, what is it? The Peach Bowl final? Is it the Peach Bowl semifinal?
The Peach Bowl is a quarterfinal this year.
Oh, the quarterfinal. Yeah. So let's just plan on that. Yeah. That's when I'll be down there. Okay.
Perfect. But well, so what's on the tailgate menu for you this weekend?
Okay, I'm going to be perfectly honest. The forecast is not looking like it's conducive to tailgating.
Fair.
In as much as if we. So I brought my griddle to Ohio State. We set up on top of a parking garage. I'll send you some pictures afterwards. It was so windy, I could barely get the thing to turn on. I fear for that on Saturday. So if we do the outdoor tailgate like we normally do, I think it's a lot of crock pot materials at this point. That's probably the best bet. But yeah, we're used to tailgating in a bunch of conditions, Jack. I don't think I've ever tailgated in like 28-degree conditions, and that's kind of what we're looking at for this game.
Yeah, the one time that game gets a night kick. You know, I remember being in school always, okay, can we get a night kick for once? For once, I know Louisville fans are very, very, very anti-noon kick as well. So everyone always wants the night kick, and the one time they get it for that game, it's gonna be just freezing. But I will be there. I'm excited to get up. I'll be in Louisville for Thanksgiving. Obviously, I'm going to be at Louisville Ole Miss for the ACST Challenge before I head back down here. So I'm excited for that. I'm super excited to head up to Bloomington and get to see a 10-1 Indiana team, which I know it's a Louisville podcast, but I can't not say it.
Absolutely. I'm sure your Louisville fans won't have anything to say about that at all. So absolutely.
Galen, really appreciate the time, man. This was an absolute blast.
Jack, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Again, Galen Clavio, host of CrimsonCast. You can find him crimsoncast.substack.com at CrimsonCast on Twitter. Been following them for many years, but especially this year without how the IU football season's been going. Galen, appreciate the time, and we'll be